What's up, gamers? Welcome back to I Forgot Salt, the YouTube channel where I talk about things that I like. Today we're going to be doing my top favorite books from 2020 and top worst books from 2020, books I liked the least, most disappointing reads, that kind of thing. I recognize it's the end of July 2021, but time isn't real.
And only God can judge me.
So we're just gonna jump right in, not really deal with a lot of introduction because I feel like I do that every video. We're gonna start with the worst books I read in 2020. Kicking that off is gonna be Recursion by Blake Crouch. Just as a brief synopsis, this book is about a cop who's investigating this disease where people have memories that aren't real. I think it's called false memory syndrome, and things just kind of spiral from there as he's investigating and like what he finds out. And then we're also following like a scientist who's working sort of on the same thing. And I think part of the reason I didn't enjoy this book as much as I wanted to, like, because this book seems like something that I would love, but I ended up getting some major plot points spoiled for me after I had purchased the book, but prior to picking it up and reading it. So I kind of, all of the major twists and turns I knew were coming, or I was expecting them, and that really brought my enjoyment of this book down to almost zero. So I would highly recommend if you are going to pick this book up, because I think objectively it's a really good book. I know a lot of people love it, but I would just go in knowing nothing. I would go in totally blind, don't read anything about it, listen to anybody say anything about it. But yeah, this was just a huge bummer for me. The next worst book on this list is Shadow on the Stairs by Blair Daniels. This is a short story collection of horror stories, sort of, that's not very scary and not very good. I talked about this a little bit in, I think, my last video where I did my second half of the year wrap up, but these stories are very short. This one's just like two and a half pages, barely long. There are some really glaring grammar mistakes, spelling mistakes, and the writing is very childish. I didn't love any of the stories. I liked probably 2 or 3 out of, over 3 or 4 dozen stories. And I was really disappointed because I had read some of this author's works before on like short stories on like scary story forums online and stuff. And I was really excited to pick up their first published work, but I just think this was not for me. Maybe I am gonna try and find another self-published short story collection that really I want to read, because I do like self-published short horror stories. I think they can be so good, but this one just missed the mark. The stories needed to be a lot longer and they needed to be a lot more fleshed out, and the author needed to probably rely a lot less on random 2 sentences before the end of the story twists and set up things a little bit better, and we do a little bit more proofreading. So Shadow on the Stairs by Blair Daniels, would not recommend. This next book is Covered in Dust. My next sort of most disappointing read of 2020 was My Calamity Jane by Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. This is the 3rd book, and it's technically a series, but all of the books are kind of standalone, don't really have any connection to the other books. A series of retellings of famous Janes with fantasy twists or supernatural twists. This one was, of course, about Calamity Jane, and Annie Oakley was in this, and Frank Butler, and these famous Wild West historical figures, and the supernatural element is werewolves. Everybody's either a werewolf or a werewolf hunter, and it just seemed like the perfect setup to hit all of the marks of things that I like. I love cowboys. I love spooky werewolf, vampire, supernatural kind of stuff like that, and I loved the humor in the previous, in the first book in the series, My Lady Jane. I wasn't as impressed with My Plain Jane, and I was to the point of thoroughly disappointed in this book. First of all, it is too long. For what is in the book, there is just too much backtracking, too much rehashing things, too much of characters having something happen to them and then going to another character and explaining, this is what happened to me and this is the conversation I had, where we as the reader have literally just read that whole event happen 10, 15 pages ago. So we know we don't need to be rehashing this. And the there was just so much repetition in this book. I could not get past it. The humor wasn't good. The jokes were not good. And a lot of the jokes that worked in the first book, like the style of the narrators coming in and breaking the fourth wall and being like, blah, 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 this is funny. It just did not hit the mark in this book and took on more of a lesson teaching tone than like a humorous tone. It just didn't work. It just didn't work. I was so bummed out about this book. And I had waffled on whether or not to continue on with their new series, which is a similar premise, fantasy retellings of famous Marys. And I don't think I'm going to pick it up because this series just progressively got worse to the point where I actively hated my time reading this book, and it kind of put me in a little bit of a reading slump. And I don't think I want to touch it, even though the covers are all beautiful. I don't think I want to continue on.
I'm so sorry. You look so pretty. You look so nice. Holy moly.
Now getting kind of into the top two, I really didn't have very many. I do have some honorable mentions, but those are mostly school books that I don't rate but didn't enjoy. So the top two worst books that I read in 2020 are sort of on the same tier. The first one is The Lager Queen of Minnesota by J. Ryan Stradal. I hated this book. I gave it 1 star. It is objectively bad. Like, on the surface, I guess you could say, like, it's a fun story about, like, 3 generations of women, but it's very clearly a book with an agenda. Let's just say that.
What's up, gamers? Editing M here. Just realized I never actually told you what this book is about. As a brief summary, it's about these 2 sisters who grow up on a farm. As they get older, their parents die, the farm is sold. One sister takes all the profits from the sale and uses that to build this like successful all-American brewery, and the other sister gets nothing, and they grow up and become older, and the sister who starts the business having trouble with her business later down the line, and then the sister who got nothing has this big family, and it has a granddaughter, and so then the third woman in the story is the granddaughter, who then ends up getting a job at another local brewery who I think is a competitor of the grandmother or the great aunt's company. So that's what it's about.
The way that the story is told and who wins and who is a bad guy and who is a good guy and who ends up worse off in the end, it's very much that the women who are, wives and mothers and who stay at home and, don't push too hard and kind of stay within these traditional roles are the women who win in the end because they do that. And the women who go out and, try to have a career and make a name for themselves and end up with a lot of money or end up being very successful without having, a family or without falling into these stereotypical roles are very much both the bad guys and the losers in the end. And it's not that they're bad people at all, because everybody in this book is a good person. But the lesson of the book seems to be that if you don't have a family and get married and do the things that like women need to do, that you will end up alone and friendless right before you die, and you will have nothing. Your life will have amounted to nothing, basically. Like, it's very depressing and horrible. And there are also some really weird economic things that are in this book. It's very much you're poor because you're not working hard enough, and the economic circumstances are your fault, and if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you'll become successful. But and it inches really close to this commentary of something totally the opposite, where a character literally acknowledges that I don't have the opportunities that your children have because I'm growing up very poor, and your children have the financial safety net of like your business, that kind of thing. And the lesson of that whole conversation ends up just being, well, I'll give you a job so you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's actually your fault because you're not trying hard enough to get the job. It was just a very bizarre read, and I really, really did not like it. And while the story itself was interesting, it just seemed like every time you thought logically a character would do something, their interactions would be something based on all these other criteria. They would go off and do something totally opposite to what you expect, but that fits in with this dual agenda of like women should get married and have families, and that's the most important thing a woman can do in their lives, and also like that your circumstances in life economically are your own fault, and like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So this was a 1 star, not a fan. And then the number 1 worst book that I read this year, which you probably already know if you've seen some of my like first couple of videos that I did in 2020, is Satan Loves You by Grady Hendrix. This book is hot garbage. I don't mean that in a like, oh, this book is hot garbage in a fun way. Like I would say Shadow and Bone kind of falls into that category where it's hot garbage. It's a hot mess, but like I love that book, you know? This is legitimately hot garbage. It's basically about a nun who is impregnated against her will and then sent to hell and has to work with Satan, who is in contention in like a corporate like structure with God. And it's just really, really bad. I have my full sort of review on it is in, I think, either my January or February wrap-up video. I go on and on at length about it. The worst book I read in 2020, and probably the worst book I've ever read up to this point, actually, which is very disappointing because it is a Grady Hendrix book, and as you'll see later, he is an author I really love. I really, really enjoy his books. Other than this one, I've given every single one of his books 4 or 5 stars. I think he's a great writer. He's got great humor. But I don't know what was going on with this one. This is one of his like first, either this is his first book or one of his first couple of books. But there's just a lot wrong with this. Misogyny, victim blaming, you could call it sexual assault if you want, divine sexual assault if you wanted to, flippant remarks about mental health, and it's not funny. It's just not funny. So yeah, worst book, not a fan. Obviously, I'm gonna keep picking up Grady Hendrix books in the future. I've got a copy of the Final Girl Support Group up there somewhere, which is his newest release, but that was awful. Moving on to some honorable mentions. These don't really have a rating or a ranked place. These are books that either were disappointments or I just really didn't like. Some of these are school reads, which means they don't have ratings. And just as a quick recap, I don't rate books that I read for school because my experience in the class or with the teacher or with students in my class almost always colors my perception of the books themselves. So I don't think it's fair to the books. So these are just a couple of books that stood out as being bad independently of my experience. The first one is Blood by Sunil Gangopadhyay, a newly translated work from Bengali, I believe. And this is sort of a book about a man whose family was brutally murdered during the British occupation of India, and a woman whose father was murdered also during the British occupation of India, and it's their relationship and, you know, kind of what happens after some things come to light about their respective fathers. And while I think this book could be very powerful, I don't necessarily either know if I was the right audience for it or if I just like didn't get it, because this is considered a Bengali classic. This was an exercise in cynicism and depression and hopelessness. I don't know what the message was. By the end, is the message that everything sucks and that we're all gonna die and that love is meaningless. The main character, absolutely hated. Have no sympathy for him. He beats his girlfriend and never faces any kind of consequence for that. And the girlfriend is the one who ends up, begging him to take her back and apologizing. And he's continually an asshole to her and never once does any self-reflection on like why he's a bad person and just sort of continually blames this cycle of generational trauma kind of thing without ever taking responsibility for his own actions. I don't think this was a very good book or a good book for me. The next book I have is Nightwood by Djuna Barnes. This is also another classic, kind of modern classic, this time of queer lit. This is, in theory, a book about lesbians at the turn of the century in France, I think. Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Okay, I didn't even get that. What I got out of it was it's just one guy musing about life and talking about really random stuff for like the entirety of the book. It's literally just a book of this one guy's this like doctor's monologues about who even knows. Like there were large periods of this book where I had no idea what was going on. And like the prose is beautiful, the writing is beautiful, but none of it is in any way. Like, there's no logical progression, there's no real plot other than, like, these two women get together and then break up and then maybe get together again, that kind of thing. This is not something I would consider enduring or even coherent. And then my last honorable mention is A Voyage for Madmen by Peter Nichols. This is about the first solo race around the world in sailboats. I was really interested in this book because I grew up sailing, so I have, some firsthand knowledge of like the mechanics of it. But this book was really bland. Like it could have been so cool about these 9 sailors who were facing all these trials and like which ones died, which ones made it, how, the ones that dropped out, what happened. But it's basically a bulleted list of facts about things without any kind of progression or narration, if you will. And I feel like almost like I was reading an extended Wikipedia page all the way through. It wasn't compelling. It wasn't organized in an interesting way. And it wasn't even organized well, I would say, because there were points where I had no idea that we had skipped from one sailor to another. And then so you're reading and you're like, wait, I thought this guy, like, died. Like, what is he doing now? And it seemed very disorganized. I wouldn't recommend it for nonfiction. So that's it for my worst reads of 2020, most disappointing reads, my top 5 plus, or my bottom 5, if you will, plus a couple of honorable mentions. And now we're going to move on to my best books of 2020, again with a couple of honorable mentions. So starting from the bottom, the 5th best book, spoilers. Starting as a little bit of a preface for this whole list, I didn't pick books that I necessarily all given 5 stars or books that were like the most enduring pinnacles of the craft, that kind of thing, but books that here in July 2021 left a really big impression on me, or that I still think about, or that I still recommend to people. Books that I just genuinely really enjoyed. Even if the books themselves may have had a couple of flaws, or that at the time I didn't think that they were like going to be favorites. And this first book on the list, 5 of 5, is probably the best example of that in this list, and that is Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey. Now, I am a huge fan of Sarah Gailey's works. I love the way they craft worlds, and their ideas are always so interesting, but I do think that their writing is getting a lot better as they put out more works. And actually, The Echo Wife, their newest work, I did end up giving 5 stars, and is actually probably one of my favorite books of all time, at least at this point. But this is an earlier release of theirs that I ended up reading last year, and it follows a private investigator whose sister is a teacher at like a parody Hogwarts kind of magical school, and at this school another teacher has been murdered. So the private investigator is brought in to investigate this murder because the magical school can't go to like the regular human police. I think that's the foundation for how this plot gets going. And they're right there, you have a little bit of a flimsy setup in that, like, why in this magical world is there not this other legal system set up, and why is the private investigator the one who has to be brought in? And it is explained in the book, but I didn't totally buy into it. One of the reasons that this wasn't a 5, it was still a 4-star. There were just things like that in it. In terms of the book as a whole and the characters and how the plot moves forward, and of course the ending and all that kind of stuff, I do think this is like a really memorable book, and I really loved the mystery and also the exploration of character between these two siblings as the private investigator learns more about the school and the students and different teachers. And I don't know, it's really stuck with me, and not just because I'm a huge fan of Sarah Gailey's work. I think I've read everything of theirs except for When We Were Magic. I just haven't picked that one up yet. So Magic for Liars, Sarah Gailey, number 5. The next book, number 4 on this list, is Annihilation by Jeff VanderMeer. This is a new, weird, horror, sci-fi kind of thing, and it's just a little longer than a novella would be. It's about 193 pages. I've actually read it again this year, so that shows you how much I enjoyed it. This book is about a woman named the Biologist. No characters are named in this book. They all go by their titles, who is part of this expedition into an ecological disaster zone in southern Florida called Area X. And she and this other group of other women are tasked with investigating it. And they are the 12th, I believe, expedition into Area X. All previous expeditions have either gone missing or come back with no memory, or come back and died shortly after returning from Area X. So they're basically starting from a very limited, like, we don't really know what's in here, go see if you can survive and bring back data. And what they find in Area X is utterly incomprehensible. If you ask me to compare this sort of style of storytelling to anyone, I would say H.P. Lovecraft, that sort of unknowable horror, unknowable cosmic horror, except that it's not cosmic, it's earth and plants and animals and this incomprehensible corruption of nature. The Jeff VanderMeer is an auto-buy author for me. He is one of my favorite authors of all time, and I would love at some point to sit down and do a really in-depth review of Annihilation and maybe the whole Southern Reach trilogy all together. I'm really talking about some of the more intense themes of what the series is trying to say, particularly in like man's relationship with nature and nature's relationship with man, and the fact that there's sort of these shifting lines of, are the humans the bad guys, or is Area X the bad guy? There's so much. He's so good, and this story is so well done. My little copy says that there is a movie made out of it. I wouldn't recommend it. It kind of doesn't really have anything to do with the books, other than the fact that there's a woman who goes into this mysterious ecological zone with a team of people, but that's sort of where the similarities end. But if you're looking for a relatively quick, confusing, but also existentially terrifying kind of read, I would definitely recommend picking this up. It is a trilogy. This is the first book in the trilogy. The 2 other books, Authority and Acceptance, are very different from this one. This one is the most distinctly horror. The other books are just more of an expansion on what's going on in the world. The way that the trilogy is set up is that the whole story is based on a real-life ecological disaster, an oil spill that happened in South Florida. And so the first book is about the disaster site. The second book is about the people managing the disaster, the organization in charge of kind of containing it. And then the third book is about, what happened to cause this, what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future, that kind of thing. So the structures of all 3 books are very different, and that's true for a lot of Jeff VanderMeer stuff. No 2 books, even in the same series, kind of go together, really. But this one is unlike anything else I've ever read, and is just chef's kiss. So good. The next book on this list is another book that has kind of made it into my favorites of all time, potentially usurping what was one of my favorite books of all time, knocking it off the list and having this one replace it. And that is Wanderers by Chuck Wendig. This book is, I guess, comparing it to The Stand, as everyone else already has sort of given away a little bit of what it is, but it is a plague story. It's a pandemic story of epic proportions. Basically, it's about this group of sleepwalkers who one day go to sleep, start walking, and never stop and never wake up. And it's the story of them. It's the story of their families walking with them, basically traveling with them. It's about the scientists who are trying to figure out what's wrong. And then in the background, there slowly is this other encroaching plague-like thing that is slowly getting closer and closer and closer to the story that we are actually reading about the Sleepwalkers. They're so intricate, the characters are so well written, and it has a lot to say. The meaning of life, religion, what it means to be family, what it means to be a family as the world is collapsing around you. I really, really love this book, and I think it does a lot of the things that The Stand did, but better. It even references a couple of times in the book, like, wow, this is just like Stephen King's The Stand. But it cleans up a lot of those meandering points of The Stand that I think turn a lot of people off, where people will just do stuff and then we won't see those characters for like 250 pages and then they'll come back and you'll be like, who are you? It tightens up a lot of those empty spaces and hones in on some characterization and really tightens up a lot of the existential conversations that The Stand tries to have, and it does it a lot better in this book, I feel. A caveat of that is that there are a lot of conversations of a more existential nature in this. There are pages and pages of characters talking about the meaning of life and the meaning of death and the meaning of God and all this kind of thing. So if you're looking for a just like straight action, plague story, people fighting, people trying to survive, gore, that kind of thing, like that's in this, but it's not the bulk of the novel. And in fact, there are large sections of the novel where I would say very little happens kind of thing, because it's about the characters more than it's about the plot, which I do think is another thing that I really loved about The Stand. Like, at the end of the day, it's not about the plague and the end of the world. That's the catalyst for these characters coming together and interacting and a bunch of shit happening. But yeah, I loved this book. I highly recommend it. Really well written, really well done, and I've already picked up Chuck Wendig's newest book, The Book of Accidents, and I'm really looking forward to reading that this year. We're now getting to the last two books on this list. This is my second favorite book that I read in 2020, and this is probably no surprise if you've been paying attention, and that is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I absolutely loved this book. I absolutely love Grady Hendrix writing in general, which is a little bit ironic considering one of his books was my worst book that I've ever read of all time. But I really think that his newer books, his more traditionally published books, have a very different feel to them. His humor is spot on, characters are really great, and his gore is really well done and scary, and then the horror elements are very terrifying. And what I've learned in reading, all of his modern books, actually, I think there's only one of his books overall in his whole catalog that I haven't read. It's about going to space or something. I'm probably not gonna read it. His books are horror. They're scary. They're about these monsters, ghosts, demons, vampires, etc., etc. But there's usually like the real villain was actually X all along kind of twist that I really enjoy. And I think that is clearer more than anything in this book. Whereas, yes, we're following this book club, ladies reading true crime, I believe. Yes, they start out reading true crime and a vampire moves into town, and it's sort of up to our main character to convince people that there's something wrong and that something has been going on in the town for a very long time. And it touches on a lot of different things. Most specifically, it touches on sexism, especially sexism in the South and traditional gender roles, and this idea of the hysterical woman, the hysterical mother. She's just making things up in her head because she's a lonely housewife. Maybe the real villain was sexism all along. And on the other side of it, there's also this underlying story of the fact that the area is divided into like a low-income area and then the suburban area that our main characters live in. And the low-income area with a large minority population has been plagued by missing children and death, the same things that are starting to creep into the lives of the suburban women, but that nobody has taken notice of because these are a bunch of Black families living in the South. So there's this other element of like, well, maybe sexism was the real villain all along, maybe racism was also one of the real villains all along, that sort of thing. So the whole point of the book is that the vampire is the catalyst for all of these problems in the community coming to light. Yes, there is a vampire and it's scary and people are dying, but that the community was deeply corrupt prior to the vampire moving in, and that a lot of these problems are being kind of exposed and brought to light because people are dying. And I really loved that element of this book. I think Grady Hendrix has tried to do that a couple times before, particularly with My Best Friend's Exorcism, which actually may have been his book before this one. I haven't read them all in order. I've read some of them in order and some of them out of order. And he kind of did that a little bit with that book. Parents not believing their teenage daughters because teenage daughters are, naturally melodramatic and they just lie and they're all about boys. Sexual assault could never happen to my daughter because she's a good girl, that kind of thing where this isn't a review of My Best Friend's Exorcism, but I think his books are really well done, and I'm really excited to pick up Final Girl Support Group. And yeah, second favorite book that I read in 2020. And at last, the best book I read in 2020, my favorite book I actually did read twice. That's enough of a hint, you might already know what it is. The best book I read in 2020 was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. You can see my dog ears, you can see my tabs. There's just so much I could say about this book, but I won't because again, I've talked about it twice already in 2 separate videos. This is basically about a family in, I think, the 1970s in a very small town whose daughter goes missing and is found dead. That's like the first page. That's not a spoiler. And the whole book is everything that kind of led up to that and everything that happens to the family after they discover that their 16-year-old daughter has died. It explores the family dynamics of parents putting their expectations on their children and being abusive parents but still being well-meaning, and the generational cycle of abuse, particularly the generational cycle of maternal abuse. It talks about sibling relationships in an abusive household. It talks about being a child who has both of your parents' entire expectations placed upon you and kind of what that does. And it explores what abuse looks like outside the traditional sense of like not being fed or like being physically abused or sexually abused, the sort of external category of emotional abuse that isn't always talked about when we talk about parental abuse and the consequences of that. It's just a really interesting exploration of family and race and gender and individuality. And I think this probably is one of my favorite books of all time, and Celeste Ng is an amazing writer, and I really do think everybody should pick it up and read it at least once in their lives. It is such an incredible book. So yeah, this was my best book of 2020. Now on to a couple of honorable mentions. These are books that I also really loved. I also still think about consistently, but didn't quite make the cut of my top 5, if you will. They're in no particular order, sort of like the honorable mentions were my worst of the year, and the first one of those is Borne by Jeff VanderMeer, another Jeff VanderMeer book. This is another sort of new weird horror book, but it is more sort of a post-human, post-apocalyptic. It's about the world having collapsed at the hands of this giant biotechnology corporation that basically destroyed the foundation of all life, and the world is uninhabitable, and every living creature has in some way become a product corrupted by this corporation that was, genetically manipulated to be profitable in some way. And it's about, now the corporation has collapsed and humanity has collapsed and everybody is not really human anymore. It's about these 2 scavengers who find an unknown product of the corporation who is a sentient creature that can take the form of anything, named Borne. And it's just sort of about these 2 scavengers, Rachel and Wick, and Borne, and the progression of Borne growing up and how the relationship between the 3 changes, and then this larger plot of like things happening within this collapsed city politically as Wick runs a sort of faction and this other character named the Magician runs another faction, and it's all a little bit convoluted but very poignant, if you will. I actually tried to read this book in 2017, I believe, and then put it down, and then picked it back up last year and started over and finished it and loved it. And I actually think I will end up reading this again sometime, maybe in the next 2022, 2023 kind of range of time, because this is very much a book where you have to read it multiple times to kind of get it, to understand what's going on and to understand the different layers of what's being said, because Jeff VanderMeer as an author is always trying to say so much. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to parse out. So like there's this, this story of Wick and Rachel and Borne, and then there's the larger story of the corporation in the past, and then there's the story of like the other creatures that are existing in this city. And then there's the larger commentary, sort of like Annihilation has, where it's about this story, but also about something else. So like Annihilation is about Area X and the Southern Reach organization, all this kind of stuff, but also about this larger pattern of ecological disaster and man's relationship with nature. And this book, is about these characters, but on a larger scale, it's also about man's relationship with nature and nature's relationship with man's technology, the sort of danger of the capitalistic view that you must pursue profit at all costs and to the detriment of living things, because that is essentially what the corporation does in this world. They pursue profit above the integrity of life itself, to the point where there is no concept of what is human and what is non-human anymore, what is natural, what is created, what is biotechnology, what is biology. And then there's also this question of, in a post-human, post-natural world, like the city, like the world that Borne lives in, where can you draw the line of what is moral and what is right and what is immoral and what is not right, if the foundation of what those rules are based on, being human, kind of no longer exists in the world. It's really interesting, and again, it's another book that I'm going to have to, it's a book that I'm going to have to read, multiple times, I think, to get more and more layers into it. And it's something I really would recommend. It's not a book I would recommend to get into Jeff VanderMeer if you are interested in his works overall. I would recommend Annihilation in that case if you're wanting to get into his works, because I think it's the most linear in a way. I would say Annihilation is the best introduction into his style of writing and his style of storytelling, and that starting with something like Borne might be ambitious, might run into the same problem I did, where you just don't like it, don't get it, that kind of thing. Honorable mention, Borne by Jeff VanderMeer. Another honorable mention from school, so again, no rating, but a book that left an impression on me, was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This I'm not going to say too much about because it was a Booker Prize winner. If you follow any kind of major literary lists, you've probably heard of this already. And what's weird about it is I can't really articulate why it's so incredible, other than just saying that the storytelling was emotionally impactful. The prose was intricate and beautiful in a way that very few other things I've ever read have been. And I feel like this is a book I'm going to come back to, years down the line and maybe read again. In short, it's a book about family in India, of sort of an upper class in India, whose niece / daughter / cousin, a little girl about, I think she's 9, comes to visit from England for 2 weeks, and during that 2 weeks dies. And it's told very non-linearly, nothing is in chronological order, and you kind of so you're told everything in the very first chapter of the story, and you have no idea what any of it means. And then as you go back in time and learn more, you pick up pieces of what is told to you in the first chapter. And then finally it all comes together at the very end. And it's very hard to talk about because there are so many things that even just a little hint would potentially be, some kind of spoiler. But I really recommend this if you're looking for something deeply literary and very moving. I really love this book, and I think it's one of those books that everybody should pick up at some point in their lives, but maybe with a lot of mental preparation. The next honorable mention is another literary fiction. This is a book I would describe probably a feral girl's book, if you will. A hot girl summer book for depressed teens. Actually, don't read this if you're a depressed teen. And that is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. Again, not sure what I can say about this book that hasn't already been said. I actually gave this 3 stars. So this is very much one of those books that I didn't give a high rating, but that has stuck with me and been a very memorable read, even so far down the line. This is about a woman who is very talented, very wealthy, has lots of friends, is incredibly successful, is incredibly beautiful, has absolutely nothing in their life that has ever gone wrong or is going wrong, and yet is massively, horrifically depressed. And she's insufferable. Her friends are insufferable. Every character in this book is so viscerally unlikable that you just want to throw the book at a wall. But basically, she decides that she's going to sort of skip a year by taking an immense amount of prescription drugs and alcohol and just sleep through an entire year to see if that will make her less depressed. And it's her story going through this and then getting to the point where she kind of blacks out for a year. How that all comes to be, it's very hard to explain this book. But for some reason, this book just really left an impression. I get why so many people hate it, and I also really understand why I didn't like it, and I also understand why I did like it, which is why it's a very hard book to talk about, because I both thought it was annoying and thought it was a masterpiece, you know? Like, I still can't decide, which is one of the major reasons it's on this honorable mention list, because it's a book I'm still kind of wrestling with, and I definitely don't think it's a book for everybody at all, and I would very much look into the book if you're interested before picking it up, but I just had to mention it. And the final honorable mention, something a little bit different, something a little more fun, something a little more lighthearted, if you will, and that is One by One by Ruth Ware. Yes, I called this book lighthearted. This is a popcorn mystery thriller, isolated slaughter book, if that's a real genre. And I think, one, this is the best book that Ruth Ware has ever written, and two, I think this is the best version of the snowed in, people keep dying, who's the murderer kind of book. It essentially follows a group of tech billionaires from this hot tech startup who get trapped in a really fancy ski lodge, and suddenly all one by one they start dying. And it's this book to figure out who's killing them, why they're being killed, and who's going to die next. And I just think it was really well done. The suspense is always there, but not to the point where you just kind of get exhausted, which is how I felt about No Exit, which has a similar theme of being snowed in and people are dying, and there was just too much to the point where you're like, okay, now I'm tired of being stressed. This does a really good job of managing the suspense while also keeping the mystery very urgent and the stakes very high. And I think all the characters were really unique, and the reasoning behind characters making different choices was very believable. I think it was just really well done, and I just really love this book, and I think it was one of the best sort of isolated mysteries that I read last year. So yeah, that was the best and worst and best list, my top fives, my worst fives of the entire year of 2020. In total, I read 147 books last year, which is a huge amount of books, more than I've ever read in a single year. I think about 40 of those did end up being manga reads. I read the entirety of Demon Slayer, which is 26 volumes, and then caught up quite a bit on My Hero Academia last spring. So if you want to speak specifically in terms of like novels or full-length books, novellas, that sort of thing, it was probably closer to 100, 110, which is still very substantial for me, at least. And I've already far surpassed that in 2021 at the end of July, but that is more because of some personal things that have been going on, so I've had a lot more time to read, and I've become a lot more comfortable with just picking up a book in my free time instead of sitting and scrolling through my phone, that sort of thing. I haven't done like a full stat breakdown of my 2020 reads, but if you can tell anything by the upload schedule of these videos, it's been kind of a game of catch up, so I probably won't. This will probably be my last video talking about the books I read last year, and I'd like to really move on to my 2021 books. Again, I've already surpassed the amount of books I read last year this year, so I have quite a bit to catch up on, but I'm hoping to really sit and film videos more consistently and try to get through things faster, a little bit more confidence. I have a new setup, I have a new camera, I've just been derailed a little bit by some health issues. Maybe I'll do a video about that at some point. I would like to do in the future a book vlog, a reading vlog, a reading list for books about or with characters with chronic illness, chronic pain, that kind of thing. I've read a couple so far this year that I've really enjoyed and that have really spoken to me. So I think, that's something I do feel strongly about doing in the future, and then maybe, talk a little bit about things that have gone on with me. And I'm really excited to get into talking about my 2021 reads. I didn't really read much at all. I think I only read a couple of volumes of manga in January, and then in February, I ended up reading 30-something books, like more books than there were days in February. I'm waiting to do that because my copy of Harrow the Ninth, which I read in February or the end of January maybe, is off getting sprayed to match my special edition copy of Gideon the Ninth. So once I have that back in my hands, I will start filming some 2021 videos. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm feeling a lot better, so I'm hoping to be able to film more. I'm excited. It's halfway through the year, but I'm hoping to restart a little bit. So thank you very much for watching. Hope you found something new that you want to read, or that is interesting, or maybe made you think a little bit back to some of the books you read last year. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one. Bye.